Hi everyone, I'm Benjamin and welcome to my book club, and this are my current top 10 horror books. Okay, let's start off by laying out the ground rules. First off, one book per author, one book per series. We don't want the list to be, 4 or 5 books by the same author, so we're going to stick with that. Second ground rule, I'm not including anything that I've read this year. I want to avoid recency bias as much as possible, and I want to save the books I've read this year for like an end of the year list. So if there's anything that I read this year that really fascinates me, I'll probably do an update to this video early next year, and it'll maybe be reflected in there. Although they're going to have a hard time. I really, really like these books. Third rule, I've stuck to novels, I believe, which was hard because some of my favourite horror books are novellas, but I'll save that for a different video. And I think that's about it. So, let's jump right in with number 10. Number 10, Penpal by Dathan Auerbach. I'm certain that I've pronounced that wrong. This story started life on Reddit, on the No Sleep forum, which I used to read a lot. Not so much now, but I used to read it a lot. But my first time interacting with the story was in this book. And it gripped me and just hit me over and over and over again. It's a story about a man exploring some interesting occurrences that he's remembering from his childhood. He talks to his mother about them, and his mother doesn't want to talk about it. His mother breaks down and crying, and causes him to really investigate his memories and look deeper into what actually happened when he was a child. And he makes some startling discoveries that are disturbing. It's a really interesting look into how the innocence of childhood hides maybe the truth from us. So as this man looks back on it, he's revisiting these thoughts and emotions through a more mature lens, and he realizes that things weren't as innocent as they were. And it's gut punching. It's fantastic. The dread starts early, and it just builds and builds and builds and builds until the finale. I think it's definitely earned its spot at number 10. Number 9, Dark Matter, a ghost story by Paver. A young man down on his luck in 1950s London. I believe it's 1950s London. 1930s London. Agrees to go on an expedition to the Arctic for a year as their sort of radio antennaman. And very quickly things start to go wrong until he is left alone in this shack on the northern coast of Svalbard within the Arctic Circle. And it's a story of isolation and how that can affect a man. It's a story of, again, dread and loneliness. It's a story of the cold. When it gets hot in summer here, I love reading cold books like this. Put the fan on, put the aircon on, and really, really immerse myself in the coldness of these books. And it's a ghost story where some things are kind of left up in the air, I think. The ending is not the strongest of any book I've ever read, but just the atmosphere and the distrust and the anger and the grief in this book, I love it. It's a bleak, dark, almost hopeless sort of area. And I love books about isolation, and this is one of my favourite books on that topic. Paver also has another book, Thin Ice, or Thin Air, one of the two, which is a very similar story. When I also really like that one, but for my money, this one is the better of the two. Number 8, The Cipher by Kathe Koja. This is Kathe Koja's debut novel, and that's remarkable to me. I've got the reprint edition that I think they reprinted in 2013. 2020, this one says. But yeah, they reprinted, because for a long time I was trying to hunt it down and it was very expensive. And it should absolutely just stay in circulation. It's such a good book. We follow our two main characters, Nicholas and Nakota, who have a interesting relationship. Nicholas, I think, truly loves Nakota, but Nakota is just around Nicholas as someone to spend some time with, someone to not be alone with. And they have a friendship, an acquaintance, a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship that is at times dull and boring and at other times very intense. And we follow these characters as they discover a hole in the basement of their apartment building. And it's a hole that doesn't seem to go anywhere. They start experimenting with it, they start dropping things in the hole, and they come out changed and different. They drop some insects down and bring it up, and they come back monstrous and deformed, until eventually Nick's hand goes in the hole. And as he pulls it out now, there's a hole in his hand. And from there, we just escalate. It's a story about obsession. It's a body horror story, which I love. It's a story about complicated relationships, one-sided relationships, selfishness. It's written almost stream of consciousness, which won't be for everybody, but for me, gave it this sort of accelerating pace. Even the dull sections about making sandwiches or going to work at a video store just had me moving forward and forward. It made me want to read faster, to find out what was happening and to follow the prose, which I think is amazing. I thought it was so well written. I've read it twice now, and I really want to listen to the audiobook as well. I think that'd be an interesting way to experience it. I can't suggest it more. Number 7, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Too many horror books have the female characters either being there as points to bounce horror off by having horrible things happen to them, or as the reward for the heroic male lead. But not this one. This is a book that features one of my favourite female protagonists ever. It's a story of hitting back against that sort of patriarchic society, about a woman being told what she can and can't do and defying that. It's set in the 1950s in Mexico, an area I don't know a lot about, but a socialite receives a letter from her cousin, who's recently married a rich British man, informing her that she thinks her husband might be poisoning her, and she asks for her cousin, the socialite, to come help. So she does. She heads off into the sort of wilderness of Mexico to this rich family estate that used to run a silver mine in the area, but the area now seems deserted. And meeting with her cousin and the family that at this house, this old English family, and she finds that there's secrets. Not only that her cousin's keeping secrets, but the family's keeping secrets, that the house is keeping secrets, and that there may not be any allies here for her. She can't leave. She can't get her cousin out. Isolation, racism, colonialism, capitalism, it's all tied together in this. Is selfishness, a deep selfishness in this story. And of how this woman can try and overcome this and help her cousin, and maybe even just help herself, because it seems like maybe she's in even worse danger at this point. And it was gripping, it was scary, it was creepy. I couldn't put it down. I think I finished it in a day. It might have been a couple days, but I'm pretty sure I finished it in 1 or 2 sittings. I found it captivating, page-turning. I've never read anything quite like it, and I would love any recommendations that are like this, with main characters like this one. Number 6 is The Fisherman by John Langan. The Fisherman is a story about two middle-aged to elderly men who have both lost their wives. I read this book just after getting married, and it hit me pretty hard. These two men talk about their grief and their sadness, or more likely don't talk about it, but experience it together as fishing buddies, until finally one of the characters learns about an old folk tale of a new fishing spot called Dutchman's Creek, which might have the power to bring back the loved ones that they've lost before. Our main character, Abe, is skeptical, doesn't really want to go along with it, but does for his friend. And then from there, things get dark and weird and bizarre, and we start asking questions of what would you sacrifice to bring back your loved ones? What's worth it to them? And what would they be like if they were brought back? Would it really be what it was before? I don't often go for the sort of nested narrative where there's another story told within a story. The entire second act of this book is kind of just our characters being talked to as we're told a different story. But it works here. It works here fantastically. I think the fact that it is kind of separated into these three sort of acts with the lead in, and then we find out this information, and then we see what the characters do with it. It works in this one. It's fantastic. I think it's a cosmic horror. It's Lovecraftian. It's a great story about loss and grief. And the ending lands, absolutely. And I can't sing more praises about it. It's fantastic. Book 5 is The Troop by Nick Cutter. It's John Carpenter's The Thing meets Lord of the Flies meets the kids from It. It's children main characters can often come across as annoying. You know, you've got grown-ups writing children, and they try and be a bit too cool and hip, and it doesn't land, and it just comes off as frustrating. But it doesn't happen in this. The main characters are believable. They act like I remember acting when I was their age, and they're put in this position. They're on a camping trip as scouts, and they come across an organism that is changing the landscape and the things around them, and they're stuck there without help, without adults, without supervision, without food, and it descends very quickly into one of the most violent books I've read. If you have qualms about reading violence against animals, you might want to stay away from this one, or at least look up the trigger warnings and skip a few pages. The scenes that are like that aren't particularly needed in the book, but they are very memorable. I remember having to put the book down and then continue again the next day. It's such a good story. It's scary. It's page-turning. You get glimpses of the outside world through through articles and interviews that paint a wider picture that our characters don't know, but we do. And it's just dreadful. It's terrifying. Book number 4 is Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. Definitely said that wrong, and I apologize. One of the best vampire stories I've ever read. Vampires these days get a bad rap from the Twilight young adult romance sort of genre. But it's books like this that remind you that they can be scary. And again, back-to-back child main characters. Again, our main character here, Oscar, is believable, likable. He's being bullied at school. He doesn't have the best home life. He's often left on his own. When he meets his new neighbor, this young girl named Ellie. And through talking to her, he grows as a character, but at the same time as he grows as a character and learns to like Ellie, he learns things about her that are strange, that are concerning, and he has to confront these truths that he's discovering. She seems unaffected by the cold. She's more agile than she should be. She's smarter than anyone her age should be. She talks in this weird fashion, almost old-timey. And it's a great story of Oscar, learning these things and deciding what to do with this information. I found it quite a difficult read. There's some sections in this book that are quite problematic, but that works towards building the main, the eventual antagonist to being such a disgusting person. It's a great book. It's so believable. The area they live in is this soulless suburban area with no history, no life, and it just, even that description doesn't do it justice. I think we've all lived, at least a lot of us will have lived somewhere where you're just living in a place. There's no history, it's not important. but it's isolated in a way that makes this story so good. As Oscar grows to like Ellie, and kids start disappearing in the town, it starts to paint a really dark, scary picture. I know that there's, I think, a couple movies based on this. I haven't watched them. Let me know in the comments if they're good, if they hold up to this. I also believe that the author has written sequels to this, which again I haven't read. If you have, let me know if they're worth reading. All right, we're in the top 3 now, and coming in at number 3 is Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. I first read Joe Hill in comics, namely his Lock and Key series, which I thought was fantastic. Then I read Heart-Shaped Box and a couple of his other books. I haven't read Nosferatu yet. I know I need to get to it. But it was only after reading those that I actually learned he was Stephen King's son. And it kind of shows. He's got it's not a similar style, but he builds characters and worlds in a similar way that they're just so believable. Heart-Shaped Box is one of the more action-packed horror books, I think. There's not like action fight scenes all the time, but I find very few other books that put the antagonist, the monster, the creature, the ghost so in your face as Heart-Shaped Box, and still manage to keep it scary. Often these books rely on the fear of the unknown and not knowing what's going to happen. But Heart-Shaped Box very quickly shows you what you're up against, how bad it is, and how scary it still is. The main character, a aging rock star from a famous band, I think of like Kiss and that sort of stuff, is obsessed with the supernatural and buys a ghost on eBay as sort of a joke. And turns out he actually does. And I haven't read a character like that before. He's scared, but he's strong, and he's going to fight this. And it's a character study on the main character, and it goes really well. I really enjoyed it. All right, number 2. We knew he had to be on here. And for my pick, my favourite Stephen King book I've read is Salem's Lot. I was amazed to find out that this was his second published work after Carrie, because it encapsulates everything I love about Stephen King. The characters and the town in Maine in this book is just so believable and so fleshed out. It's, again, another vampire story that reminds you why vampires can be scary. I've never read vampires in any fiction. I've never seen them in any movie or game that are scarier than the ones in this book. It's the first time King inserts an author character as the protagonist. It's the first time he delves really deeply into the town like this, I believe. And a lot of the stuff that makes King so good in his later works, I think, starts here. It's a story about an author going back to the town he grew up in. And he wants to write a book on this house on a hill, Marston House. And the darkness that happened to him there. And the house itself is amazing. It's visible almost from the entire town. Anyone he talks to has a story about this house and why it's bad. And it's just been rented by a new Austrian businessman that no one's seen. And from there, we just continue to experience the characters and their life in this town. And it's just so believable. And when the violence and the scariness start, it's just so scary. There's a child goes missing early on in the book, and there's a brutal dog murder as well that is just gut-wrenching. And from there, it just takes off. And it's not a fast book. I don't think any Stephen King book is really a fast book. But as it meanders its way through the story, the dread and the terror build until we get to an ending that I loved. I don't understand people hitting against Stephen King's endings. For my money, he writes fine endings for horror books, and this one really lands for me. And I loved it. And for my money, my favourite horror book I've ever read, the one that stays in my mind, the one I can't ever stop thinking about, the one I have 2 copies of, so I've got one to read and one to display, is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I don't know what I can say about House of Leaves that hasn't already been said. I'm probably not even smart enough for this book. I've read through it 3 times, and every time I discover new things. It's famously hard to read. It's written in a very strange manner. You have to turn the book on its side, turn it upside down, read pages backwards. There's narratives in narratives in narratives. There's 2 competing sets of footnotes. There's the story of a video. There's appendices that you have to read through. But in the end, it's worth it. It doesn't have a traditional narrative. The main narrative follows a academic writing about a documentary. So we're already stories in stories. And in this documentary, it's about a house, an impossible house that seems to move and change. And that's only just the start of it. From there, you've got this article about the documentary. You've got footnotes from several different characters talking about stuff in the video or talking about their own life. It can go for pages without talking about the video again, and it'll just go on and on about this person's life. And none of it seems connected until it all does. And nothing got under my skin as much as House of Leaves. I'm not selling this book as much as I should. It's a confusing mess that is hard to read and is absolutely worth it. So there you go, that's my top 10 favourite horror as of right now. I'd love to hear in the comments what you think. Which books you think I absolutely should have put in. Good chance I just haven't read them. So it would be fantastic to get those suggestions so I can maybe change the list next time. Check out my current read-along. We're currently reading The Forge of God by Greg Bear. And I'd love if you could leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks very much. And remember, keep reading.